Hello everyone, I'm Samantha Jane Smith.
And I'm Jacob Keynes, and you are listening to the Classical Queer Podcast.
Been lucky to recently interview two great composers. First up was Rufus Isabel Elliot, who has just released a new album of music called Am's Come Ashore, Turn Over. The album is the story of two characters walking along a never-ending beach and the love, loss and anger between them. My second interviewee, Eveshak Ghost, also has a new album of piano music out called Chocolat. We'll be discussing how she composed this album as well as listening to a piece from an upcoming album called Badger. First on this month's show is Rufus Isabel Elliot, who recently released an album of new music called Am's Come Ashore, Turn Over. Here is one of the pieces from that album called Achilles' Lyre with the Bridge of Silver and Everything, after which I talked to Rufus about the album. Hello, everyone. I'm here today with Rufus Isabel Elliot, who's just released an album of music entitled Am's Come Ashore Turnover. So welcome to the show, Rufus.
Hi, thank you.
Okay, so perhaps a good place to start is for you to tell us a little bit about the album and how it came about.
Sure. So Ams is a piece that I began working on maybe a couple of years ago. I was thinking about conversation and, I guess on a very basic level, human interaction, what it's like to be yourself and speak to someone else. And I was thinking about that through our voices, how we sound different and how our experiences are, maybe living in our voices in some ways. And when you speak to someone else, you become more aware of the things in your own voice that maybe you like or you don't like, or that are just neutral sort of facts of how you are in the world. And this kind of snowballed until I worked on it mainly more or less started it in March 2020 and more or less finished it in I guess September 2021. So it is in some ways kind of peak lockdown vibes that I worked on it kind of more or less every day for a year. And over the course of that time, at some point in sort of being kind of workmanlike and just kind of making the music in a quite sort of almost technical way, gathering things and trying to make little parts of it wherever I could, I kind of realized that there were these characters and that they had their own lives and sort of motivations, and they were in a particular place, which is this eternal beach, and that they were going down it, and that they had, there was this kind of story that had come through no willing of my own, but I just became aware one day that was what the story was. And then, that was just kind of just took me with it to the end.
Okay. I mean, that's kind of interesting. So it sounds like a really, I guess, organic process where you didn't, it took you rather than you took it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, it's kind of like reaching a critical mass. And then at that point, it just, up until that point, I was working and I was gathering stuff and I was thinking. And then after that, it was kind of like just finding out what it was through the piece itself. I think that's, it's a really exciting kind of imaginative scope to open up, and it puts you very in touch with your sort of unconscious mind. Or deeper feelings that you have about the things you were writing about or what you thought you were doing that turns out not to be what you were doing at all, which I think is a really nice place to be.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting because often, when you talk to composers, they have a very sort of well-defined view of what this piece is going to sound like at the end. It's very, they've got a very rigorous thing. We're going to do this, and it sounds like that. But we do come across people with the almost opposite view, and you sound like that, where you start with sort of a feeling, and it's feelings that take you through rather than having a final composition in front of you.
Oh, it's definitely feelings that take me through. I love that phrase. Yeah.
That's and also I guess you were saying about how this was voices and this is kind of a lockdown piece, if you want to call it that. I mean, do you feel in a way that maybe that there was a fortuitous timing there? I in a sense, because we've been so dependent on our voices and not having, physical contact, not having being with some people, that I wonder if that sort of has made some effect in the way this piece feels.
For sure. I think that's definitely true. Even on a really practical level, I realized that the instrumentation is like the instruments that I have in my house. They're the instruments that I could pick up and play. Whereas maybe if you're meeting with friends, you might write something that they would write. You know what I mean? Like it's a bit more, it's very kind of insular then if everything is something that I could play myself, is quite kind of interesting. That was another unconscious thing that just kind of happened. But the other thing that happened when I was working on, the the lockdown and the coronavirus prompted me to move back to the Northwest Highlands a lot sooner than I otherwise might have. And then I was living by myself in this place, and feeling very close to some parts of myself and some parts of my experience. And some things that maybe I'm quite alienated from in somewhere like Glasgow. That's not really part of like the community or the conversation there. And the fact that I was living alone and, being very sort of mentally self-reliant in that way, I think also like really like allowed the sort of slight madness of the process. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned you said voices, that all these beings that have a life within this piece, as it were. I mean, do you think that's a reflection of parts of you talking? Is it that way? Or I mean, I'm not saying it's, I don't want to make it sound like you've got all these people living inside you, but you know what I mean? You have these thoughts of, sometimes I find you have, these thoughts that come from somewhere else, as it were. And is this what you think is happening? Is it in a dialogue?
Yeah, I think what I really like about how the piece turned out is the ambiguity. In a way, it didn't quite occur to me that the characters would maybe turn out to be fragments of a single self. Although I think that is certainly a way that one could read it, and it is, I suppose, a little bit how I feel about it myself. That I started out identifying very strongly with the character, the protagonist, and then as the process went along, kind of naturally, I suppose, like you have to think more and more about the antagonist, this character Ams, and then start to feel more ambiguous about their motivations, and you start to understand more about how this character feels, or like how there's maybe some joint responsibility or whatever. And then like the fact that the piece is kind of about the blurring of the boundaries between these two characters, and how that leads to sort of control maybe, or like some event. And I really liked that, like a lot of when people have responded, it's really kind of like grasped that, I think. Like Robert Barry wrote this really nice thing about how it could be a really passionate love letter, or it could be like a death threat glued together from fragments of a newspaper.
Yeah.
That like it's kind of like it's like a bit it's ambiguous within itself, and I feel ambiguous towards it, I suppose.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean that's kind of a metaphor for life, I think, in a way. I mean, a lot of life is this ambiguity between the two extremes, and the way you manipulate that path through those extremes. So I guess that's kind of a good life metaphor, really. So
yeah, I mean, maybe. I suppose. I mean, I think it's true that it's very archetypal in the sense that it is about like the self and the other, and so as soon as you start thinking about that, you're thinking about like, especially because some aspects of the piece is kind of about like violence and relationships, then you are thinking about like responsibility and care, and one of the hardest parts for me to write was this movement, the second speech of the Antagonists, which is when like the event that happens between these characters has happened, each of the characters gets to say one more thing. And I found it really challenging to think, what does the antagonist say now? Like, what do they feel? That was like it took me a long time to start even putting pen to paper for it, because I found that very, challenging, but important.
My perspective, thinking about my history, I would say that the most difficult thing to actually talk about is the bit that's the most difficult thing that's hidden away, or the most, if it's like the antagonistic part, or the part that is the nagging part, or something else, the bit that you don't show of yourself, the bit that's always hidden, is always the most difficult bit to know what it really says. And I think so. It's kind of interesting, and a kind of, I think most people have that in them in some way. So
for sure, I think everyone must surely have that in them.
Now, the other thing, of course, besides this, is that this has got a very much, for me, a highlands feel to it. I mean, it has this. I know this sounds a bit corny, I know, in a way, but it has this idea of, like, for me, of desolate moors, misty days, that feeling. And some of this comes, of course, because you've got a Scottish traditional singer, Josie Vallely, who sings on it. And kind of the whole thing gives you this, for me, this highland feel of being out on the moors on one of those typical Scottish days.
Thank you.
Well, okay.
That's very kind.
Well, I guess that's what you're after. I mean, I guess, with where you are and all of that, that's the kind of feel that you were after. And it's sort of...
I'm really touched again whenever people say something like that, and people, especially like when I hear that via people who I maybe don't really know, maybe don't know that I live in the Highlands, and they sort of come back and say that it reminded them of like the mountains or something. Because I suppose with music, especially like something that's quite ostensibly abstract, like this piece maybe is in some ways, you can maybe feel like it would be imposing to try and make it feel like it was to do with these mountains. But it was really important to me that it was drawing on parts of my life when I've lived in the Highlands, and things that happened that could only have happened there. And if you're sort of living life mainly out and about, and you're quite kind of itinerant, and that there's there was quite a sort of special part of my life, I suppose, that I was thinking about, and the bassist who plays in it, in the recording, Stevie Jones, who's an amazing musician, was up in Skye with us to do the second performance that we did. And the morning after the gig, we dragged each other up at like 6 a.m. and we went up Blaven, which is this really incredible hill in Skye, really jagged black rock that just like stretches across the whole. It's like a wall when you're going onto the peninsula of Elgol. It's just amazing. And so we went up there, and we got to the top at maybe like 9 a.m. in the morning. We just kind of sat up there, and it was sleeting. And he kind of said, like, I've had some tunes from the Arms piece in my head like this whole time, and it feels very appropriate. And I was like,
yes, absolutely, yes.
It's like at home, and it was connected to something that I really wanted to feel connected to, but that it's easy to feel. I guess it was there was some fear in me of being alienated from it, and maybe being alienated from it like through the music or through the process that I've gone through and trying to trying to compose with it. That's quite a kind of scary thing in a way. So it was nice to feel that other people have kind of have detected that on the airwaves, and it's kind of started to live some way.
The people I've talked to, I played the music on the radio, and I've actually talked to people about it. If you've been there, then I think you do. It is, your music does ooze. I don't know if that's the right word. Ooze out this kind of Highland feel to it. But it is very much a specific Highland feel. I think for me, it is kind of the one which you said about like being out in the mountains, a bit isolated with the elements around you and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there's the element of sort of maybe outsiderism a little bit. That's being a little bit of a stranger, rather than, like you're saying, the sort of the Cayley house and the sort of community. Yeah,
absolutely. So now also this was linked to the Overat project. So there are going to be some people who don't know what that is. So maybe you could just say a little bit about that.
Yeah, Overat is a trans, non-binary and gender diverse music making world that sort of began in March 2020. We did a gig in Glasgow, and it was all about voices and how we speak, how we sing, times when we can remain silent, and that can be a political action as well. And from that point, this British organisation, Sound of Music, got involved and supported me to create a kind of 2021 season, I suppose, that has incorporated new commissions by a handful of trans, non-binary and gender diverse musicians in Scotland, workshops, resources, tours, all kinds of good stuff. And that included in March of this year, or March 2021, that the Overat released an EP of commissions, one by Malin Lewis, who's a traditional musician, a piper from the Isle of Skye. Eileen Shona originally, and then the Isle of Skye. And Matthew Arthur Williams, who is a photographer and a kind of DJ and producer. And Harry Josephine Giles, who is a poet, sort of spoken word artist, and a punk vocalist.
And punk rock star as well. So yes.
Yeah. Many hats. So that was called Folks Songs. So the idea was that it was kind of like the traditional music of the trans community, or like some small offering of some of the kind of music that we might make in the trans community.
Yeah, and we actually have you on episode 3 if anybody wants to go and take a listen where you're on that. So talking about that, so that's good. And so now you've done this. No doubt you're going to take a little break. But what's next for you in 2022?
Yes, rest has been a very important thing. Everyone's burned out, and everyone should go and have a winter hibernation. I am currently, just starting out on some really exciting projects. And one that I'm looking forward to hopefully releasing in January is called it's another album of music for solo violin, and it's called 3 Sexual Pieces for Solo Violin, This and This and This, and it's weird because it's the piece before the Ams piece. But it's been longer in the works, and it's kind of about it's about all my favorite topics: stories, testimony, honesty, love, violence, sex, mountains.
Wow,
that's the mix.
Well, when you've got that out, we'll have to have you back, and you can talk about that. But I'm
looking forward to sharing it with you.
It's been a pleasure talking to you again, and thanks ever so.
Thank you.
My second interviewee this month is Eveshak Ghost, who also has a new album of piano music out called Chocolat. I had a really interesting interview with her, talking about her method of writing and playing music, as well as discussing her upcoming work, Matilda. After the interview, we will hear a piece from Matilda called Badger. So I'm here today with composer and pianist Eveshak Ghost. Welcome to the show, Eveshak.
Hello. Nice to be here.
Now, you've got some really exciting news. You're releasing an album of piano music called Chocolat.
Yes. I've just sort of released that. It was originally for patrons, but after about a year, I decided to release a physical copy anyway because, it's better that way.
Can you say something about the music on it? Because I think it's kind of like all variations around a similar theme or something. Is that right?
Yes, it's inspired by historic tuning, so it's not in the equal temperament. It's in a historic temperament called Rukmeister 3. So it's a different kind of sound and inspiration behind the pieces, and it was written extremely fast. Sometimes I would write up to 6 or 7 pieces a night. So it's mostly improvisations. So So it's a little bit looser. It's not as structured. It's just ideas. It's something that I thought might be good.
Does this kind of, I mean, you say it's historic temperament. So do you find this comes into a lot in your music? Is this something you're quite interested in, bringing in these old styles, if you like?
Not massively. I sort of made a friend with somebody who's a piano tuner who's into historic temperament and who's rather eccentric friend of mine. And I thought I'd give it a shot because, as he said, every note in equal temperament has the same harmonics and sort of personality, whereas in historic temperament, some things actually sound more in tune and some things sound less, so it gives more personality to each chord, thus inspiring the composer to use notes and chords in a different way to each other.
That's kind of interesting. So when you came to write this, how did it affect your writing? Did you find you had to think of it in a different way?
Yeah, I found myself landing on different keys intentionally because I knew that they would have this flatline sound that you can't get on any equal temperament piano. And it gave the whole album a certain flavour, which I find harder to try and write that sort of music on a different piano, even though it's an extremely subtle difference. It's very subtle. Yeah,
I must admit, as a non-musician, I mean, I don't play a musical instrument. When I heard the pieces, I've heard quite a lot of them. I wouldn't have noticed, to be honest, that they were in a different temperament. It's kind of for a non-musician, it probably is a little bit more difficult to pick up. But the sound is certainly different to some of them. That I noticed.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more zany is the word I would use. It's a little. It goes one way and then it swings. You'd have to compare to an equal temperament piano. I think it's like F major, C major, A sharp major. Those sort of chords have a certain sound that has a very satisfying, almost synthesized sound that you wouldn't hear in equal temperament, but you'd have to compare the two. But if you listen to the temperament of Chocolat for too long and those chords and go back to equal temperament, that equal temperament sounds out of tune sometimes because everything we hear is out of tune.
You had to detune your piano or tune it to the right temperament, did you?
Yeah, on this one I actually used a VST piano tech. You can change all the temperaments. So I thought, well, I might as well play with it. And I quite liked a certain one and I stuck with it and I thought, oh, I've got to record something because the other album, the main project, is going to take time. And I wanted something to give to people to say that I have been doing something with the time. And that's basically all it is. So you mentioned a main project. Maybe you'd just like to say something a little bit about that. Yeah, the films aside, the main piano project is called Matilda, and that's based on a piano that we have called Matilda. We've called the piano Matilda, that we bought. It's like a 1920s piano, and it's about 12 pieces, I think it will be in the end, including the badger and other animals and other certain little things. And those are the pieces that I've taken time to write, that I've sort of practiced over a couple of years. And they're more challenging and a little bit more structured. So that's what I'm aiming for, maybe this year coming, to release that.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, we look forward to hearing that. Now, one of the things you said, that this is pretty much an improv set of pieces, the Chocolat, and you've got kind of an interesting way of composing and playing music because you have your own notation in the way you write your music.
Yeah, I very rarely use that notation, actually. That's been something that I've evolved in the last couple of years. I use it to learn the more complex pieces that have lots of chords, lots of notes, lots of data to learn, to absorb into the mind. So when I'm desperate and I want to be away from computers and recordings, because I play by ear, I've tried this as an experiment and it's actually worked really well because I know it in my mind. And having the notes there in front of me using this very strange, very raw notation, I know the shapes that I want to see. So I've made it so that I've programmed it so that it takes a MIDI file and it sort of pumps out this sheet music. And it actually works. And I've managed to learn pieces much quicker.
So it's kind of a visual. You just see the pattern and that pattern gives you the music. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
And I've always seen patterns. The fundamental thing of my learning by ear, or learning by heart and memory, really, because ear is when you replicate somebody else's music, is all about shapes, and it's mainly about triangles actually of the hands. So it's all about shapes and curves and arches and pyramids and stuff. And if you see that, everything is simplified anyway.
I do find this quite amazing actually, because all the music you play is basically played from memory. And I mean, I guess that means each version you play is always slightly different maybe, and you've got a slight interpretation every time. Is that how it works?
Yeah, totally. Certain pieces are more loyal to the original vision. So Badger, whenever I play Badger, the notes are probably going to be exactly the same pretty much every time. But sometimes I might try staccato on that bit and a bit of that there, and I might bit that slower. I try it because nobody's told me how to play it. So I play it how I feel at the time. But other pieces like Chocolat, some of those I will never play again. That was hit record and then go, wow. And then I'll never play that ever again. I might stumble across part of it by accident in the future, but that's its shot. It had its moment, and that's it. So you get the extremes between the two.
That's incredible, and a kind of a, I don't know the word to use here. It's kind of a very in the moment sort of creation that lasts for a short time and then disappears again, essentially, if you haven't recorded it. But it's kind of like a one shot event, which is kind of unique in a musical way, I think.
Yeah, I don't perform to people very much. That's my goal, is to be able to perform to people. That's the long-term thing. And I get very, very nervous playing piano in front of people because I'm so not used to it because of a dark past of not being allowed to play the piano. But I find improvising easier than playing a set piece, because if you go wrong on the set piece and you lose where you are, it's no longer the piece you attempted to play. But improvise, you can at least attempt to get yourself out of it. So if I'm nervous and I say I can't do this, I will probably just improvise the entire concert, because it's so much easier to do, depending on how you feel. But I do want to play my pieces because I've put a lot of work into them, and the quality of the structure will be better than an improv.
It's kind of incredible though that you can just sit there and improvise. I mean, I guess like it's a way like jazz, I guess. A jazz musician will have some idea of what they're doing and then improvise around it. Do you have this kind of like basis in your mind and then you just go off that basis or something?
It's actually two approaches. It is a bit like jazz, I suppose. The two approaches. One is I always hear music in my head. I actually have a streaming orchestra of original music in my head that I can tune into 24/7, and it never ends. So I feel I will never ever run out of music. It's just capturing it and being able to play it or record it is the challenge. It's not writing. So I'll hear something in my head and then I'll attempt to find the notes. And I'm not a perfect pianist, so I might make mistakes or I might hit the wrong notes. But generally, the intervals, I'll work it out. The other method is to just let the hands create a very strange shape based on triangles and different secrets to music that I won't go into, that I believe in, and almost hit at random, but educated random, and see what it sounds like, and then deal with it there and then as the sound comes and hits you, and you have no idea what it's going to do, but it's probably going to sound okay because your muscles have already learnt what doesn't sound okay, and over time you learn those shapes. It's very complex, but that's the two different approaches. One's by feel and one is by what's already in your head.
I mean, it's kind of interesting. You do hear of people who like have you hear about experts in things who let their body or whatever it is take control of their mind in a sense. And is that it? And I guess it sounds a little bit like that to me. Like your hands are actually just going like, we're going to do this, and we know what we're doing almost. I mean, I know it's not like that because your mind isn't disconnected, yeah. But it kind of sounds like that. It
is sort. I suppose I'm not used to talking about this. People usually don't show as much interest, and so I keep it to myself. Most of the time, if I might have a whole piece in my head and try to find it, but if I'm improvising, I often hear the next 2 seconds, the next chord or the next couple of bits in my head, and then it's up to my hands to find it and to keep up. So sometimes the hands outrun the mind, and sometimes the mind outruns the hands, and sometimes I'm just not in the mood for it. that's about it, really. It varies from day to day.
I mean, that sounds to a non-musician, that sounds incredible. I mean, it just sounds like, amazing that you can just sit there and, you start and your hands are going to do something. You can just carry on. And because, I mean, when I listened to the Chocolat, which you say was improvised, it doesn't sound like it's improvised. You know what I mean? It doesn't sound like you're going, okay, I wonder where we're going next. It sounds like you've got it planned, which is kind of fascinating.
Yeah. Most of it, over half of it definitely is improvised. Other bits I will sit and write very quickly. I think it's going to do this chord, this bit, and then I will do a few takes and I'll put time into it. But generally I would finish the piece in the night. As I say, sometimes it was up to 5 or 6. I think 7 was the record, and they'll all be improvised. So sometimes I think, hang on, I like this a little bit more. I'm going to put a tiny little bit more time into this because I think it's worth it. So when it's structured, I probably have very quickly come up with a structure, but I've only done a certain amount of takes, or even sometimes it's one take. And if I think that's good enough, stop, continue, and just continue bit by bit. So it's improvised, but with a breather in between. And then some of them are actually hit record and do the entire take in one, and then that's it. And there might be 1 or 2 bum notes, and I'll go back and shift it. But sometimes there isn't. So it's kind of improvised. There's not much time that's gone into it at all.
Yeah. And I mean, to be honest, it would be absolutely fascinating to hear that live. I know it's kind of a difficult thing to do, but it would be fascinating to hear, one of your pieces, and then how it changes over time, if you know what I mean. Every time you play it, because I guess your mood affects it, what's going on around you, everything will affect how you play that back.
Yeah. I would be more happy to do improvisation like the Chocolat thing live. I mean, I'd love to play things like the Badger live. I'd be nervous, but I'd give it a shot. I'm working on it, and I do it a little bit, or I did. But I'm staying at home at the moment because I'm a bit scared of going outside.
Don't blame me, quite frankly.
I've got projects, so I'm just staying at home and finishing music projects, film projects. I'm quite happy to stay in this town and pretty much stay here. I'd be up for doing that. I think I've got a rig that can do it. I think I've rigged it up. I've actually got it all on now anyway, because the microphone goes through it. So we could do that in the future if you like.
Kind of sounds fascinating. Yeah, I must admit. Yeah, let's. I think for me, this is something that I think we need to explore more. If we say maybe we'll have you back later on, maybe next year, and we can talk a little bit more, and you can demonstrate some of these things. Maybe it'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I'd love that. And I've also got all my film music as well, so it's fully orchestral. And I actually did a 4-album progressive rock thing. That didn't really take off, but there was a lot of messaging. I sing on that as well and play the drums. So there's all sorts of things there, lots of messages, about my lifestyle. So I'd be very interested.
Now we're gonna hear a piece of yours in a few minutes. This one we've already mentioned, called Badger. Great title, a great piece of music. Can you tell us something about it and why it's called Badger?
Okay, so it's on the Matilda sort of collection album. It's a badger because Caroline, my partner, outside her house, there are badgers that we feed. And they come along, and we got to a point where we've set up cameras and we could film them, and they've gone right up to us, like 2 feet away, and we've sat there and they haven't, And unfortunately, we found one of the badgers had been killed. And when I showed up and we were really upset, and I sort of moved the badger into the bush, and I started playing, and she actually said, "That sounds like a badger." And I said, "It does." In fact, it started off as one of the Chocolats. The badger was an improv. Yeah, actually. And she said, "Sounds like a badger." So I said, "Wow, okay, I will learn this. I will learn this improv," which is a very hard thing to do because you haven't structured it that much. So I spent the entire night, like a good 4 or 5 hours, just practicing non-stop, learning the notes. And then the next day I tried more, and then eventually a few little things changed, little bits added and little details. There is the original Chocolat. It was removed from the album because I wanted to have it something better, but I do have the original recording. And it's just we absolutely love badgers. We're just obsessed with badgers, really. And it has it's the circle of life again. So if you listen to it, it's a young badger, it's playful, it gets older, it goes down the steps, it sees the dangers of the world, Eventually, it does go to heaven in the end. And if you look at the notes of the MIDI, I found the other day, I didn't realise, there are actually badger heads drawn on the actual notes, perfect badger heads every single time it does the theme, and I didn't realise. So it's a very badgery piece, but it's not a funny piece. It's playful, but it is, yeah.
But it's got a serious nature to it. I mean, I kind of, as you say, it's not what I would call a whimsical piece, but it is playful, but it's got a serious part to it as well, is where I would look at it.
Yeah. Well, it is ultimately about the dangers of mankind and cars and things like that, and eventually, the happier place. And it's definitely inspired by the innocence of these sort of animals, and all the people that do all these terrible things, and you get these badgers and they're sort of minding their own business, and the foxes come and eat with them, and they don't bother each other. The fox could be behind the badger and it doesn't even flinch, but if a person comes along, then it's all panic.
Well, they've learned to fear us, unfortunately. That's the sad thing. Yes. Yeah. Well, look, that's Badger. That's going to be out with Matilda, which will be out when, do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm still practicing. It gets very, very, very challenging at the end. It gets to some pieces that are the hardest pieces I've ever written to perform. So I've written like 90 something percent of that, and I'm just practicing. I'm hoping to record it. The recording you have is a temporary, it's just a take. It's not the final recording. I'm hoping to record it on the actual Matilda piano for next year, and I'm thinking about doing a Kickstarter and having it on vinyl, but that's another story. We'll have to look into the costs.
Sounds great. Well, look, when you've got it all done, Matilda, please come back and we'd love to talk to you. In the meantime, people will have to get hold of Chocolat. And where can they get hold of that, by the way?
I've got my own little website, theresulka-records.com, and that's a physical CD. It's a big chunky double album because I like physical copies of albums. I'm a little bit old fashioned, and that ships worldwide. And I don't mind signing it or anything you want. You just give me a message and it's not a problem.
Sounds perfect. I'm sure you're going to get some requests. Thank you so much for coming, Eveshka, and hope to see you again sometime in the new year.
Thank you very much.
So that's all for this episode. You've been listening to the Classical Queer podcast, and Jake and I look forward to being with you next month. The incidental music is courtesy of Jared Miller, and the show was produced by Samantha Jane.